The contrail streaked across the frozen February sky over northern Germany as Oberleutnant Franz Stigler rolled his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into position, behind what he assumed would be an easy kill that morning. Another American escort fighter limping home after the brutal gauntlet from England. His squadron had been feasting on these vulnerable machines for months now, shooting them down as they ran out of fuel, trying desperately to shepherd bombers deep into Reich territory. German pilots called it the harvest, and they laughed while they killed. But as Stigler closed to firing range on this particular aircraft, something felt wrong. The sleek fighter ahead of him didn't have the familiar profile of a P-47 Thunderbolt, or the stubby fuselage of a P-38 Lightning he knew so well. This was something new, something his intelligence briefings had mentioned only in dismissive passing. A North American P-51 Mustang. The Luftwaffe pilots had laughed at these aircraft as mediocre performers nobody needed to worry about. Nothing compared to their superior German fighters that ruled the skies. What Stigler didn't know in that moment, what none of the Luftwaffe High Command had fully grasped yet, was that he was staring at the aircraft that would systematically destroy German air superiority. Over the next 15 brutal months, the fighter he was about to engage wasn't the underpowered disappointment German intelligence had described with contempt. It was something entirely different, something they said was physically impossible to build. By March 1944, just weeks after that encounter, approximately 175 of these transformed Mustangs would appear over Berlin, for the first time in aviation history. They would fly escort missions that military planners on both sides had calculated were mathematically impossible to accomplish, and in doing so, they would turn the tide of the air war over Europe in a way that no single weapon system had achieved before. This is the story of how one aircraft went from being dismissed as a low-altitude disappointment to becoming the weapon that broke the Luftwaffe's back. And it all came down to one critical change that transformed everything about what this fighter could do. One change that would save 10,000 American lives over the skies of Germany. To understand the magnitude of what the P-51 Mustang achieved, you need to understand the crisis facing American bomber crews in late 1943. The mathematics of death. The United States Army Air Forces had committed to a strategy that many experienced officers considered outright suicidal. They believed they could defeat Nazi Germany through strategic bombing alone, striking deep into enemy territory to destroy the industrial capacity that kept the Wehrmacht fighting. This wasn't just a tactical decision or another military operation. It was a fundamental bet on a completely new theory of warfare that had never been tested. While the Germans had perfected tactical air power, using their Luftwaffe as mobile artillery to support ground forces brilliantly, the Americans and British championed something different: strategic bombing. The idea was elegant in its deadly simplicity. Don't just fight the enemy's armies on the battlefield. Destroy their ability to wage war by obliterating factories, oil refineries, transportation networks, and the entire industrial infrastructure that fed military operations from behind. But there was a massive, absolutely fatal problem with this strategy that nobody could solve. Getting bombers deep into Germany meant flying through hundreds of miles of enemy-controlled airspace, defended by the most sophisticated air defense network ever created by any nation. The Luftwaffe had thousands of fighters positioned at airfields across occupied Europe, all dedicated to one single mission: destroying American bombers before they could reach their targets and drop their bombs. In the summer of 1941, when North American Aviation Company first delivered 2 prototype Mustangs designated XP-51 to the United States Army Air Forces, nobody imagined these aircraft would become the answer. In fact, the US FAA didn't even place an immediate order for production. The initial flight tests showed the aircraft had potential, but it wasn't revolutionary enough to demand urgent procurement or funding. It took intervention from General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, to keep 55 Mustangs from a British order for evaluation purposes. Even then, most of these early aircraft were converted into F-6A photo reconnaissance planes for taking pictures. They were assigned to observation squadrons and sent to North Africa in spring 1943 to take pictures, not fight enemy aircraft. The reason for this lukewarm reception became brutally clear once pilots started flying the early P-51A model in combat conditions. These aircraft were powered by Allison V-1710 engines, the same power plants used in early P-40 Warhawks and P-38 Lightnings. And while the Allison engine performed beautifully at low altitudes near the ground, it had a critical weakness that made it nearly useless for the mission American bomber crews desperately needed it to accomplish. Above 15,000 feet, the Allison engine's performance fell off dramatically, losing power. By 20,000 feet, where B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators conducted their bombing runs through the heaviest flak, the P-51A became sluggish and underpowered. It simply couldn't maintain the speed and maneuverability necessary to dogfight with German interceptors at those critical altitudes. So the early Mustangs were relegated to theatres where air combat happened closer to the ground. The China-Burma-India theatre received most of the P-51A production run, where the aircraft performed admirably in low-altitude fighter-bomber roles. But nobody was calling it a war-winning weapon or anything special. It was just another competent fighter bomber doing important but unglamorous work, far from the decisive battles. Meanwhile, American bomber crews were dying in horrifying numbers over German-controlled territory every single day. Without fighter escorts capable of staying with them all the way to targets deep inside Germany, bomber formations faced relentless attacks from Luftwaffe interceptors who had perfected their killing techniques. The fighters that could escort them initially, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, simply didn't have the range to accompany bombers beyond the German border before having to turn back desperately to refuel. This created what bomber crews called with grim fatalism the Gap of Death, a zone deep inside Germany where bombers flew without any fighter protection whatsoever, vulnerable to coordinated attacks by German fighters that had perfected tactics specifically designed to break up bomber formations and shoot down as many aircraft as possible before they could drop their bombs and escape. The statistics were absolutely brutal and unsustainable for any military force. On missions to heavily defended targets like ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt or aircraft plants at Regensburg, bomber losses exceeded 20%. That meant 1 in 5 aircraft that took off from England in the morning didn't come home that night. 1 in 5 crews, 10 men per bomber, either killed instantly, captured, or missing presumed dead. At those catastrophic loss rates, the mathematical certainty was that bomber crews wouldn't survive their required 25 mission combat tours. Something had to change immediately, or the entire strategic bombing campaign would collapse. What the Army Air Forces desperately needed was a fighter that could fly as far as the bombers travelled, fight effectively at altitudes above 20,000 feet where the war was happening, and still have enough fuel remaining to dogfight with German interceptors before escorting the surviving bombers safely home. Every expert in aviation engineering said such an aircraft was physically impossible to build. The physics simply didn't work according to known aerodynamics. Fighters needed to be small and light to be maneuverable in combat. Long range required massive fuel tanks that added crushing weight and drag. High-altitude performance demanded supercharged engines that consumed fuel at prodigious rates. You couldn't optimize for all 3 characteristics simultaneously according to established engineering principles. Every design was a compromise between competing factors, except that in the fall of 1942, engineers working on both sides of the Atlantic were about to prove all the experts catastrophically wrong, and they were going to do it by taking that mediocre P-51A Mustang and making one critical change. That would transform it into something unprecedented in aviation history. The breakthrough came from an unlikely partnership between American designers and British engine manufacturers, working together. Rolls-Royce had spent years developing the Merlin engine, the same power plant that had made the Supermarine Spitfire one of the most effective fighters in the Battle of Britain. The Merlin was a masterpiece of engineering, a liquid-cooled V-12 that maintained excellent performance at high altitudes, thanks to its advanced 2-stage supercharger that compressed thin air. Someone, and history isn't entirely clear who deserves the credit, had the revolutionary idea of mating the Merlin engine to the P-51 Mustang airframe. It seemed like an impossible long shot at first glance. The aircraft had been designed completely around the Allison engine with specific mounting points. Fitting a completely different power plant would require extensive modifications to engine mounts, cooling systems, propeller configurations, and weight distribution throughout the entire aircraft. But when test pilots finally got behind the controls of the prototype Merlin-powered Mustang in late 1942, they discovered something extraordinary, something that would change the war. One test aircraft in the United States reached 441 miles per hour at 29,800 feet altitude. That was nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51A at that same altitude. It wasn't just an improvement or a minor upgrade, it was a complete transformation of capability. The Merlin engine didn't just give the Mustang more speed at high altitude where it mattered, it fundamentally changed what the aircraft could accomplish in combat. The combination of the Mustang's exceptionally clean aerodynamic design and the Merlin's powerful high-altitude performance created something unprecedented. A fighter that could cruise at 350 miles per hour at 25,000 feet while sipping fuel at rates. That gave it unprecedented range nobody thought possible. North American aviation immediately pivoted into emergency mass production of the Merlin-powered variants. Designated P-51B when built at the Inglewood, California plant, and P-51C when manufactured in Dallas, Texas. The changes were far more extensive than just the engine swap, though. Engineers redesigned the entire engine installation from scratch, relocated fuel tanks, modified the cooling system, and optimized dozens of smaller components throughout the airframe. By December 1943, the first P-51B and P-51C Mustangs arrived in England and were immediately assigned to the 354th Fighter Group, which proudly called themselves the pioneers of a new era. These pilots and ground crews knew they were flying something special that felt different. The aircraft's performance numbers were impressive on paper, but nobody yet understood the strategic implications of what this fighter could achieve in the skies over Germany. The German Luftwaffe intelligence services had received reports about the new American fighter from spies and reconnaissance, but their assessment was dismissive and contemptuous. Yes, the Americans had fitted a British engine to their mediocre low-altitude fighter. So what? German fighters like the Focke-Wulf FW-190 and the latest Messerschmitt Bf-109G models were proven combat veterans, with experienced pilots who had been fighting and winning since 1939. How much difference could one new fighter type really make to the outcome? They were about to find out in the most devastating way possible. In early 1944, the United States Army Air Forces launched Operation Point Blank with unprecedented force, a systematic campaign to destroy Germany's capacity to wage war through relentless strategic bombing. The operation had two primary objectives that would determine the war's outcome. First, cripple German fighter production by bombing aircraft factories and related industrial facilities into rubble. Second, destroy the Luftwaffe itself by forcing German fighters into battle where American numerical superiority could grind them down, through unsustainable attrition. The key to both objectives was the transformed P-51 Mustang, now arriving in massive numbers. With external drop tanks, the Merlin-powered Mustang could fly escort missions to Berlin and back, a round trip of over 1,100 miles. That meant American bomber formations would have fighter protection all the way to their targets deep in Germany, and all the way home again. There would be no more gap of death where bombers flew defenseless through the heart of German airspace, while Luftwaffe fighters picked them off one by one. On March 6, 1944, the strategic situation in the European air war changed forever in a single day. United States heavy bombers struck Berlin for the first time with full fighter escort coverage from takeoff to landing. Approximately 175 P-51 Mustangs accompanied the bomber stream all the way to the German capital and back, engaging in running dogfights with Luftwaffe interceptors across hundreds of miles of enemy territory. The psychological impact on German fighter pilots was immediate and absolutely devastating to morale. For years they had enjoyed a significant tactical advantage that made them feel invincible. They knew exactly when American bombers would be vulnerable to attack, could calculate precisely when escort fighters would have to turn back for fuel desperately, and could mass their forces for coordinated attacks on defenseless bomber formations. Now that entire advantage was gone forever. The Mustangs stayed with the bombers all the way to target and all the way home, protecting them. And they weren't just passively defending the bomber stream like earlier escorts. Mustang pilots had authorization to leave the bombers when German fighters were spotted approaching, chase them down aggressively, and destroy them before they could organize attacks on the bombers. The hunters had become the hunted, and German pilots knew it. German pilots quickly learned that engaging a P-51 Mustang at high altitude was nearly suicidal. The American fighter had superior speed, excellent acceleration, and remarkable maneuverability for an aircraft with such long range. The Mustang could outturn most German fighters above 20,000 feet where combat happened. It could outdive everything the Luftwaffe had in their inventory, and it could pursue retreating German aircraft back to their own airfields and strafe them during landing, when they were most vulnerable and defenseless. But the transformation wasn't complete yet, despite these early successes. Even as the P-51B and P-51C models were proving themselves over Germany in early 1944, North American aviation was preparing something better. To introduce the ultimate development of the Mustang design, the P-51D incorporated every lesson learned from combat operations and pilot feedback into what would become the definitive version of the aircraft. The most obvious change was the bubble canopy that replaced the earlier Razorback design with restricted visibility. This gave pilots complete 360-degree visibility in all directions, a massive advantage in the fluid chaos of aerial combat, where spotting an enemy fighter a few seconds earlier often meant the difference between life and death. Pilots who flew both variants unanimously praised the improved visibility of the P-51D over everything else. But the changes went far beyond just the canopy upgrade. The P-51D carried 6 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns instead of the 4 guns mounted in earlier models. These weren't just any machine guns taken from storage. The Browning 50 caliber was one of the most effective aircraft weapons of World War II period, firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds at 750 to 850 rounds per minute, with enough striking power to tear apart aircraft structures and detonate fuel tanks catastrophically. The increased firepower came with a completely redesigned ammunition feed system. That dramatically reduced gun jamming, one of the most frustrating problems pilots had experienced with earlier models. When a Mustang pilot squeezed the trigger in a P-51D, all 6 guns fired reliably every single time, putting a devastating weight of fire onto the target. German pilots quickly learned that even a short burst from a P-51D's guns could be instantly fatal. The P-51D also featured the K-14 gyroscopic gun sight, a sophisticated computing device that helped pilots lead moving targets accurately. The gun sight calculated deflection automatically based on target range and angle, displaying a reticle that showed pilots exactly where to aim to hit a maneuvering enemy aircraft. Combined with the reliable 6-gun armament, this made the P-51D lethal in the hands of even moderately experienced pilots. Nearly 8,000 P-51D Mustangs were built, making it by far the most numerous variant produced. They began arriving in Europe in large numbers during the spring of 1944, just as the preparations for D-Day intensified across southern England. By the time Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the P-51D had become the primary long-range escort fighter of the United States Army Air Forces in Europe. The impact on the air war was measurable in stark statistics that told the story clearly. In January 1944, before the arrival of long-range Mustang escorts, the 8th Air Force lost 223 heavy bombers on missions over Germany. By May 1944, with hundreds of P-51 Mustangs providing escort, bomber losses dropped to 156. Despite flying more missions against more heavily defended targets than ever before, The trend continued throughout the summer and fall as Mustang numbers increased. But the losses that really told the story were on the German side, suffering catastrophic casualties. The Luftwaffe was hemorrhaging experienced pilots at completely unsustainable rates that would destroy them. Every major bomber raid now resulted in massive dogfights where German fighters faced numerical disadvantage against better-equipped American fighters that could pursue them relentlessly anywhere they tried to hide. Luftwaffe pilot training programs couldn't replace losses fast enough as the killing accelerated, and the quality of replacement pilots declined steadily as experienced instructors were pulled into combat units. By the fall of 1944, the Luftwaffe fighter force was effectively broken as an organized fighting force. German fighters still rose to defend the Reich when American bombers appeared overhead, but they did so with diminishing effectiveness and growing hopelessness. Inexperienced pilots flew obsolescent aircraft with chronic fuel shortages against overwhelming numbers of technologically superior American fighters that hunted them mercilessly. The outcome of individual engagements was rarely in doubt anymore. The P-51 Mustang hadn't just won air superiority over Germany through superior numbers. It had achieved something far more significant strategically. It had made the strategic bombing campaign viable by solving the escort range problem that had seemed mathematically impossible to overcome according to every expert. Those B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators that previously flew unescorted through the gap of death now reached their targets with fighter protection, dropped their bombs with greater accuracy because they weren't being torn apart by fighter attacks beforehand, and returned home with acceptable loss rates that made the campaign sustainable. And it wasn't just about protecting bombers from attackers anymore. Mustang pilots actively hunted the Luftwaffe wherever they could find it hiding. They strafed airfields, destroyed aircraft on the ground, attacked training facilities, and made it impossible for German fighters to operate with the freedom they had enjoyed earlier in the war. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a credible fighting force. The final accounting of the P-51 Mustang's contribution to victory in Europe is absolutely staggering. Mustang pilots were credited with destroying approximately 4,950 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat alone, more than any other Allied fighter in the European theatre. They destroyed another 4,131 aircraft on the ground during strafing attacks on airfields. Those numbers represent a substantial portion of total Luftwaffe losses during the final 18 months of the war. But the deeper significance went far beyond impressive kill counts in reports. The P-51 Mustang proved that the strategic bombing doctrine, which many had dismissed as unworkable after the devastating losses of 1943, could succeed with the right supporting technology. It demonstrated that air superiority wasn't just about having good fighters sitting on runways. It was about having fighters that could go where they were needed and stay there long enough to accomplish the mission completely. The transformation from that dismissed low-altitude fighter to the weapon that broke German air superiority happened because engineers refused to accept that the laws of physics made long-range high-altitude escort impossible. They found a solution by combining the Mustang's exceptional airframe design with Britain's superb Merlin engine in an unlikely partnership, and they proved that sometimes the difference between a mediocre weapon and a war-winning one comes down to one critical change that transforms absolutely everything. When Oberleutnant Franz Stigler encountered that lone P-51 Mustang over Germany in February 1944, he was looking at something terrifying. An aircraft that would render his entire way of fighting obsolete within months. The Luftwaffe's tactical advantages built through years of combat experience would evaporate, as hundreds and then thousands of these transformed fighters filled the skies over Europe. The hunters would become the hunted, and there would be nowhere left to hide from American fighters. Today, the P-51 Mustang stands as perhaps the most iconic fighter aircraft of World War II. Recognized instantly by aviation enthusiasts and historians worldwide. Its polished aluminum skin, bubble canopy, and distinctive profile represent not just technological achievement, but a turning point in military aviation history that changed everything. Museums preserve these aircraft as flying monuments to the men who flew them into combat and the engineers who created them. But the real legacy of the P-51 Mustang isn't in museums or airshow performances. It's in the fundamental lesson the aircraft taught about warfare technology and the importance of solving the right problem. American military planners had committed to strategic bombing as their primary contribution to defeating Nazi Germany. When that strategy failed due to unsustainable bomber losses, they didn't abandon the approach or give up. They identified the critical problem escort range, and they solved it through innovation. The P-51 Mustang didn't win World War II by itself alone. No single weapon system does that. But it made victory possible by enabling the strategic bombing campaign that destroyed Germany's capacity to continue fighting. It gave American bombers the protection they needed to reach targets deep inside Germany and return home. It forced the Luftwaffe into a battle of attrition they couldn't win mathematically. And it demonstrated that sometimes the difference between defeat and victory comes down to recognizing what needs to change and having the courage to make it happen despite what experts say. Those German pilots who dismissed the early P-51A as just another mediocre American fighter weren't wrong at the time, based on the evidence available to them. The Allison-powered Mustang was indeed limited to low-altitude operations and unimpressive. But they failed to imagine that American and British engineers would transform that aircraft into something unprecedented that would hunt them to extinction. By the time 1,075 P-51 Mustangs appeared over Berlin in March 1944, the Luftwaffe was facing an opponent they had never encountered before. A fighter that could go anywhere, stay as long as necessary, and win almost every engagement it fought. The laughter stopped quickly after that first devastating encounter, and by the time the war ended 15 months later, the P-51 Mustang had written its name into aviation history as the fighter that changed everything about how air power shaped the outcome of World War II. 10,000 American bomber crewmen came home because of this aircraft. 10,000 men who would have died in the gap of death flew home to their families instead because one fighter could finally go the distance.